I've interviewed 43 children who claimed they've been taken by aliens, and I believed exactly none of them until I met Ethan Price. That's not entirely true. I didn't disbelieve them either. Belief wasn't part of my methodology. I documented, I recorded, I cataloged data points and cross-referenced testimony against known psychological patterns. I was a professional observer, and professional observers don't have the luxury of belief or disbelief. We have documentation. We have evidence. We have files organized by date and location and demographic markers that turn human trauma into searchable databases. For 11 years, I maintained that distance, that clinical detachment that let me sit across from sobbing children and grieving parents and ask my careful questions without flinching, without feeling, without letting their pain become mine. I told myself I was doing important work, that someone needed to create a comprehensive record of these experiences, regardless of their objective truth. I told myself that my lack of emotional investment made me more credible, more scientific, more valuable to anyone who might someday want to understand what was happening to these people. I was lying to myself. The distance wasn't professional, it was protective, and it shattered completely on a sheep station in the Australian outback when an 8-year-old boy drew symbols I'd seen before in cases I'd never shared with anyone. Symbols that shouldn't have existed outside my private files. Symbols that meant either I'd been documenting something real for over a decade, or I was losing my mind. I still don't know which possibility terrifies me more. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, buried between spam and interview requests I'd never answer. The subject line read, "My grandson needs to talk to someone who will listen." And the sender was Margaret Price, from a town in Western Australia I had to look up on a map because it was barely large enough to have a name. I get messages like this constantly. Desperate people who found my website or seen one of my short documentaries online and think I'm someone who can help them make sense of what happened to their child, or their spouse, or themselves. Most of them I delete without reading, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, because if I responded to every request, I'd never finish the work I'm already committed to, never complete the documentation that justifies all of this. But something about Margaret's email made me open it instead of adding it to the trash folder, where 90% of my correspondence ends up. She wrote that her grandson Ethan had been living with her for 6 months since his parents died in a car accident, that he was a quiet boy who kept to himself, but was adjusting as well as could be expected under the circumstances. 3 months ago, he'd started waking up in the middle of the night, claiming he'd been somewhere else, somewhere white and bright where beings with large dark eyes spoke to him without using words. Margaret had taken him to doctors who prescribed therapy and medication for trauma-induced nightmares, but the episodes continued and intensified. Now Ethan spent hours every day drawing pictures of what he'd seen, filling notebook after notebook with symbols and patterns that Margaret said looked like nothing a child should be able to create. She'd found my work through a documentary I'd made about childhood contact experiences in Scandinavia, and she was writing to ask if I'd be willing to come to Australia to interview her grandson, to add his account to whatever records I was keeping, because she had the terrible feeling that no one was taking this seriously, and that Ethan needed someone to witness what was happening to him before it was too late. I should have deleted it. I had 3 other cases I was actively working on, including a family in Brazil who'd been experiencing ongoing phenomena for 18 months, and the flight to Australia alone would cost more than I'd budgeted for travel that entire quarter. But I read Margaret's email 4 times, and each time I felt something I'd trained myself not to feel during these initial contacts, something that felt uncomfortably like urgency. I responded that I could be there in 2 weeks if she was willing to let me film the interview and include Ethan's testimony in my ongoing documentation project. She wrote back within an hour saying yes, that she'd pick me up from the airport in Perth, that it was a 6-hour drive to the station, but she'd make sure I had a place to stay. I booked the flight that afternoon. The sheep station was more isolated than I'd anticipated. 3 hours past the last town that could reasonably be called a town, accessible only by a dirt road that cut through flat scrubland stretching endlessly in every direction. Margaret was waiting at the small regional airport in a dusty pickup truck, a woman in her late 60s with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. She barely spoke during the drive, except to point out occasional landmarks, a windmill here or a dried creek bed there, and I was grateful for the silence because it let me prepare myself mentally for what was coming. We arrived at the station just before sunset, the sky turning deep orange over low buildings that looked like they'd been there for generations. Margaret led me inside to a small kitchen where she'd set up tea and biscuits, told me Ethan was in his room drawing but would come out when he was ready, that I shouldn't rush him or push him to talk before he felt comfortable. I told her I understood, that I'd worked with many children who'd experienced trauma and knew how to move at their pace. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already started the interview process, that from the moment I'd walked through the door I was observing and cataloging details that might become relevant later. Documentation doesn't begin when you turn on the camera. It begins the moment you arrive. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table drawing when I walked in, and he didn't look up. Margaret had called him out about 20 minutes after I'd arrived, after I'd set up my camera and audio equipment and reviewed the consent forms she'd signed, allowing me to record and potentially use the footage in my work. The boy was small for 8 years old, dark-haired and pale-skinned like he didn't spend much time in the brutal Australian sun, and he had the kind of stillness that you don't usually see in children his age, the absence of fidgeting or nervous energy that often indicates either deep trauma or unusual maturity. He was working on a drawing with colored pencils, his hand moving in careful, deliberate strokes, and when Margaret introduced me he glanced up briefly, nodded once, and went back to his work as if I wasn't there. I'd learned over the years that the worst thing you can do with a traumatized child is rush them, so I sat down across from Ethan and didn't say anything for almost 5 minutes. Just let him work while I organized my notes and made sure the camera angle captured both of us in frame. Margaret brought more tea and then excused herself, saying she'd be in the next room if we needed anything, and I appreciated that she understood the interview needed to happen without her presence potentially influencing Ethan's responses. When he finally finished the drawing he was working on, he set down his pencil and looked at me with eyes that seemed far older than 8, dark brown and intense and completely unafraid in a way that made my skin prickle with something I couldn't immediately identify. I introduced myself properly, told him my name was David Reese and that I'd traveled around the world talking to people who'd had unusual experiences they couldn't explain, that his grandmother had told me he'd been through something confusing and maybe frightening, and that I was here to listen if he wanted to talk about it. I explained that nothing he said would get him in trouble, that I wasn't a doctor or a therapist but just someone who collected stories, and that he could stop talking at any time if he felt uncomfortable. He listened to all of this without expression, and then he said, in a voice much calmer than I'd expected, that he wanted to tell me about the gentle ones because they'd told him someone would come to listen, and he thought I must be that person. The gentle ones. I'd heard similar terminology before in other interviews, children describing their abductors with language that seemed wrong given what they'd allegedly experienced, calling them kind or friendly or helpful when by all accounts they should have been terrified. I made a note and asked Ethan to tell me about the first time he'd met the gentle ones, to start from the beginning and include as many details as he could remember. He picked up a fresh sheet of paper and started drawing while he talked, his hands moving automatically like the act of drawing helped him access the memories, and his voice stayed remarkably steady as he described waking up 3 months ago in a white room that wasn't his bedroom. He said the room was perfectly white, walls and ceiling and floor all the same color with no shadows anywhere, and there was a soft light coming from everywhere at once that didn't hurt to look at even though it was very bright. He was lying on something smooth and slightly warm that held him gently but firmly so he couldn't move. And he wasn't scared because he could feel that whatever was holding him didn't mean to hurt him, that it was being careful. The gentle ones were standing around him, 3 of them that he could see, and they were taller than adults but very thin with skin that looked gray or maybe white depending on how the light hit it. Their heads were larger than human heads, smooth and hairless, and their eyes were enormous and completely black, no white parts at all, just deep darkness that seemed to go on forever when you looked into them. I'd heard descriptions like this in probably 30 of my 43 interviews with children, the classic imagery that had become so embedded in popular culture that it was impossible to determine if people were describing genuine experiences or unconsciously reproducing what they'd seen in movies and television shows. I kept my expression neutral and asked Ethan how the beings communicated with him, whether they spoke out loud or used some other method. He said they didn't make sounds with their mouths, but he could understand them anyway, that their thoughts appeared in his head like his own thoughts, except he knew they weren't his because they felt different, calmer and slower and very patient. They told him not to be afraid, that they needed to show him some things, and that afterward they would take him home and he would be safe. The drawing he was working on while he talked was taking shape into something geometric, a pattern of intersecting lines and circles that was far more complex than what I'd expect from a child his age. I made another note and asked what kinds of things the beings had shown him, whether he meant they'd shown him images or taken him somewhere else. Ethan said they put pictures directly into his mind, not like dreams but more real than dreams, like memories of things that hadn't happened to him but that he could see perfectly clearly. He saw other children in white rooms like his, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all lying on the smooth surfaces while the gentle ones stood over them. He saw the inside of a ship that was bigger than any building he'd ever been in, with walls that seemed alive and lights that pulsed in patterns that meant something he couldn't quite understand. He saw Earth from very far away, small and blue and fragile looking, and he felt an overwhelming sadness that he didn't think was his own emotion but was coming from the beings, like they were sorry about something they had to do. I asked him how long the experience lasted, whether it was minutes or hours, and he said he didn't know because time felt strange there, like it was moving differently or maybe not moving at all. Eventually the gentle ones told him they were finished and that he needed to remember what they'd shown him, that it was important even if he didn't understand why yet. They said other people would come asking questions and that he should tell them everything, should draw the pictures they were putting in his mind, because someone needed to see the patterns and understand what was happening. Then he was back in his bed and it was morning, and his grandmother was calling him for breakfast, and when he looked at the clock, only a few hours had passed, but it felt like he'd been gone much longer than that. The pattern he'd been drawing was finished now, and he pushed it across the table toward me. I looked down at it and felt my stomach drop, felt the careful professional distance I'd maintained for 11 years start to crack and crumble. The symbols were intricate and precise, geometric shapes interlocking in ways that created a larger pattern, and I recognized them immediately because I'd seen them before. 2 years ago in Norway, a 9-year-old girl named Karina had drawn virtually identical symbols during an interview I'd conducted in her parents' farmhouse outside Oslo, with only the minor variations you'd expect from different children's hands reproducing the same source material. That case had never been published, never been shared outside my private files, because the symbols had disturbed me in ways I couldn't articulate, and I decided the footage wasn't ready for public documentation. I told myself I was waiting for more context, more corroborating evidence, but the truth is I'd buried that case because it scared me, and I didn't know what to do with it. I asked Ethan where he'd seen the symbols, and he said they showed them to him so he could remember. My hands were shaking slightly as I picked up the drawing, holding it carefully by the edges like it was evidence at a crime scene, which in some way I suppose it was. I turned on my phone and pulled up a photograph I'd taken of Karina's drawings 2 years ago, a photo I'd kept for reference even though I'd never shown it to anyone, and I held it next to Ethan's paper. The match wasn't approximate. It was virtually exact, with only the slight imperfections you'd expect from hand-drawn reproductions. The same intersecting circles, the same angular lines connecting at precise degrees, the same smaller symbols nested inside the larger pattern like a language I couldn't read but somehow recognized as meaningful. I felt a cold sensation spreading through my chest, the kind of physical response to fear that I'd trained myself to suppress during interviews but couldn't control now because this wasn't something I'd prepared for, wasn't something my methodology had accounted for. I set down both drawings and tried to keep my voice steady as I asked Ethan if he'd ever seen pictures like this before, maybe on television or in books or online. He shook his head and said he didn't watch much television, and his grandmother didn't have internet at the station except for her phone, which she barely used. I asked if anyone had shown him drawings or talked to him about symbols or patterns, and again he said no, that the only people he talked to were his grandmother and his teacher at the small school he attended once a week when Margaret drove him into the nearest town. The logical explanations I was reaching for kept slipping away from me, leaving me with possibilities I didn't want to consider because considering them meant either someone had accessed my files without my knowledge and was orchestrating this for reasons I couldn't fathom, or these children, separated by thousands of miles and multiple years, were genuinely experiencing something connected, something coordinated, something real. I tried to maintain the interview protocol, tried to ask my standard follow-up questions about timeline and physical details and emotional response, but my mind was racing through implications I couldn't stop. Ethan seemed to notice my agitation because he paused in his drawing and looked at me with those two old eyes and asked if I was okay, if I needed water or wanted to take a break. The question was so incongruous, a traumatized 8-year-old checking on the emotional state of the adult who was supposed to be helping him, that I almost laughed. I told him I was fine and asked him to continue, to tell me more about what the gentle ones had communicated to him. He said they'd told him he was special, but that he wasn't the only special one, that there were others like him all over the world who'd been chosen to remember and to share what they'd been shown. They said the drawings were important, that they contained information people needed to see, even if those people didn't understand the information yet. When I asked what kind of information, Ethan shrugged and said he didn't know exactly, just that the patterns meant something about where they'd been and where they were going, about the places they visited and the times they came. He described it like coordinates on a map, except the map wasn't of Earth, but of something bigger and more complicated that he didn't have words for. The most chilling moment came near the end of the interview when Ethan had produced 7 complete drawings and was starting on an 8th. He looked directly at the camera, not at me, but at the lens itself, like he knew someone else might be watching this footage someday. And he said in that same calm voice that the gentle ones wanted him to show me these symbols specifically. They'd told him someone would come who collected stories about the gentle ones, someone who'd been to many places and talked to many children, and that person would understand when they saw the patterns. They said this person needed to see that the experiences weren't random or separate, but part of something larger, something that had been happening for a long time and would continue to happen. He paused and tilted his head slightly like he was listening to something I couldn't hear, and then he said the gentle ones wanted me to know they were grateful for my work, that I'd been helpful even though I didn't realize how. I ended the interview then, very abruptly, thanking Ethan for his time and telling Margaret I had everything I needed. My hands were shaking so badly I had trouble packing up my camera equipment, and Margaret noticed because she asked if I was feeling well, if maybe the long trip and the heat were affecting me. I told her I was just tired and needed to get back to my hotel, and she offered to let me stay the night at the station since it was already getting dark and the drive back was long. But I said I'd be fine. I needed to be alone. I needed to think. I needed to go through my files and confirm what I already knew, which was that something impossible had just happened, and my entire understanding of what I'd been documenting for 11 years had just inverted itself in ways I wasn't prepared to process. The drive back to town took 3 hours, and I don't remember most of it. My mind caught in loops, trying to find rational explanations that kept dissolving under basic scrutiny. I checked into a cheap motel and sat on the bed with my laptop, pulling up photographs of drawings from my archived cases, comparing them to the images I'd captured of Ethan's work. The matches were undeniable. Whatever was happening to these children, it wasn't isolated incidents. It was coordinated. It was intentional. And somehow, I'd been documenting it without realizing what I was actually recording. I didn't sleep for 3 days after I got back to Portland, The flight home was a blur of anxiety and obsessive note-taking, filling page after page of my journal with questions I couldn't answer and connections I couldn't dismiss. And by the time I landed at PDX, I'd convinced myself that the only way to quiet my mind was to go through every case I'd ever documented and look for the pattern I'd somehow missed. My apartment is essentially an archive at this point, filing cabinets lining the walls of my living room and spare bedroom, boxes stacked in closets containing hard drives and backup drives and physical files that I've accumulated over more than a decade of work. I'd always told myself the organization was meticulous, that I could find any case within minutes using my indexing system, but I'd never actually laid everything out chronologically to look for connections across cases. I treated each incident as discrete, separate data points to be cataloged individually. That was the whole point of my methodology, to avoid making assumptions or seeing patterns that might not actually exist. But the truth is, I'd been avoiding this kind of systematic comparison because some part of me didn't want to see what I might find. I'd buried the Norway case, archived the Brazil footage without proper review, told myself I was maintaining objectivity when I was really maintaining denial. But the pattern did exist, and once I started looking for it, I couldn't understand how I'd missed it for so long. I pulled files from 43 cases spanning from 2013 to present, laying out drawings and photographs on my living room floor in chronological order. 17 of those cases involved children who'd drawn symbols or geometric patterns during or after their experiences. I'd always noted these drawings in my documentation, but had never compared them systematically, because I'd convinced myself they were individual expressions of trauma, the mind trying to make sense of incomprehensible experiences by creating order through art. Looking at them all together now, spread across my apartment floor, the repetition was impossible to ignore. The same symbols appearing in 2015 in Norway, 2017 in Brazil, 2019 in Japan, 2021 in Iceland, 2022 in New Mexico, 2024 in Australia. Not similar symbols, virtually identical ones, with only the minor variations you'd expect from different children's hands executing the same underlying patterns. Slight differences in line weight and proportion that actually made the core similarity more disturbing rather than less. I created a map, printing out a world map and pinning the locations of every case that involved these specific symbols. They formed a rough circle, or maybe an ellipse, distributed around something central that I couldn't identify because the center point fell somewhere in the mid-Atlantic where there was nothing but ocean. The distribution wasn't random. It was too precise, too evenly spaced, like someone had calculated optimal coverage for something and was working through the location systematically. I measured distances between points and found they were consistent, within a margin of about 50 miles, which seemed meaningful, but I couldn't determine how. I checked dates and found the incidents occurred in waves, clusters of activity separated by months or sometimes years of relative quiet, and the frequency seemed to be increasing, with more cases reported in the last 2 years than in the entire previous 9. The next logical step was to verify these connections by contacting the other families, the other children who'd drawn these symbols, to see if there were additional details they might have shared, or if any of them had experienced ongoing phenomena. I started with the most recent cases and worked backward, pulling contact information from my files and making phone calls I probably should have made years ago if I'd been doing anything more than passive documentation. The first 3 families I reached were confused by my questions, said they'd moved past the incidents and didn't want to revisit traumatic memories, asked me politely to remove their information from my records. The 4th number was disconnected. The 5th went to a voicemail that was full. The 6th was answered by someone who said I had the wrong number, that no one by that name had ever lived at that address. I went through the entire list over 2 days, making call after call, and the pattern that emerged was more disturbing than the symbols themselves. Out of 17 families with children who'd drawn these specific patterns, I could only reach 4, and 3 of those were hostile or uncooperative. The other 13 had vanished in various ways. Phone numbers disconnected, forwarding addresses that led nowhere, families who'd apparently moved without telling neighbors where they were going. Maybe there were innocent explanations. People move after trauma, change numbers, go off-grid to start fresh somewhere else. I didn't have access to government databases or law enforcement records, just the surface-level searches that any civilian could conduct, which meant I could easily be missing mundane explanations for some of these disappearances. But the percentage bothered me. 76% felt like more than coincidence, even accounting for normal patterns of families relocating after traumatic events. In 3 cases, I found social media accounts for the parents that had been active up until a specific date and then went completely silent. No posts or updates or activity of any kind. In 2 cases, I discovered that the children themselves had disappeared from public records entirely. No school enrollment information, no medical records that I could access through the limited channels that are available to me. Nothing to indicate they still existed in any official capacity. I tried to tell myself there were rational explanations, that my limited investigatory capabilities were showing me only a fragment of a larger picture that might be perfectly ordinary. But 13 out of 17 felt significant, especially when the 4 families I could reach all had children who'd drawn less detailed versions of the symbols, simpler patterns that might not have been complete enough to warrant whatever was causing the others to become unreachable. I called Margaret in Australia using the number she'd given me, hoping to at least verify that Ethan was safe, that my visit hadn't somehow put him at additional risk. She answered on the first ring, and I could hear the tension in her voice before she even said hello. She told me that Ethan had disappeared 3 weeks ago. She said he'd gone to bed normally. She'd checked on him at 10 like she always did, and he was sleeping peacefully. But when she went to wake him for breakfast, his bed was empty. According to our account, his pajamas were folded neatly on the pillow, and his slippers were placed by the bed like he'd gotten up and dressed himself, but there was no sign of him anywhere in the house or on the property. She told me she'd called the police immediately, that they'd organized search parties that combed through hundreds of acres of scrubland, that they'd brought in dogs and helicopters and checked every abandoned building within 50 miles. She said they found his pajamas in a field about a quarter-mile from the house, but there were no footprints around them, no disturbance in the dirt, nothing to indicate how they'd gotten there or where Ethan had gone. The investigation was still open, but the police had told her honestly that after 3 weeks with no leads and no ransom demands and no body, the chances of finding him alive were minimal. Margaret asked me if I thought what happened to Ethan was connected to what he told me, to the gentle ones and the symbols and the interview we'd conducted. I wanted to tell her no. Wanted to say there was no possible connection, because that would have been the professional response, the appropriate boundary between documentarian and subject. But I couldn't lie to her, not when I was staring at my living room floor covered in evidence that 17 children had drawn these impossible symbols, and 13 of them had subsequently become unreachable through normal channels. I told her I didn't know for certain, but that I was seeing patterns in my research that troubled me, that I'd documented other cases with similar elements, and some of those children were also missing or their families had become inaccessible. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that I've replayed in my mind 1,000 times since. She said Ethan had left a note, just one sentence written on a piece of paper and tucked under his pillow where she'd found it after he disappeared. The note said, "They came back for me like they promised. Don't be sad." Sarah Chan called me at 2 in the morning and told me to send her the raw footage from Australia. I'd called her the day before in a state of barely controlled panic, describing what I'd found in my files and asking if she could help me make sense of it from a psychological perspective, maybe identify patterns of shared delusion or cultural contamination that would explain how children across different countries could produce virtually identical symbols without any apparent contact. Sarah was one of the few people from my previous life who still took my calls, a colleague from my journalism days who'd gone on to specialize in childhood trauma and developmental psychology, while I'd disappeared down the rabbit hole of documenting unexplained phenomena. She'd always been skeptical of my work, but respectful of my commitment to it, and she was the closest thing I had to a friend who understood both the investigative rigor I'd tried to maintain and the psychological toll that kind of work extracted. She'd listened to my frantic explanation with the patience she reserved for dealing with people in crisis, asking clarifying questions and taking notes, and finally she'd said she needed to see the actual footage before offering any professional opinion. I'd sent her the unedited files from the Ethan interview, Hours of material, including setup and equipment checks, and the conversation with Margaret before and after the actual interview. Sarah called me back 6 hours later, and I could hear something in her voice I'd never heard before. A kind of controlled fear that suggested she'd found something she didn't want to have found. She told me to pull up the footage and go to timestamp 14 minutes and 32 seconds to watch Ethan's face during a specific moment in the interview. I opened the file on my laptop and navigated to the time code she'd specified, a section where Ethan had been describing what the gentle ones looked like, how their eyes appeared completely black, but somehow conveyed emotion and intention. Sarah told me to pause the video and zoom in on Ethan's eyes, to look carefully at the reflection visible in his pupils. I'd reviewed this footage multiple times already, but had been focused on what Ethan was saying and drawing, not on subtle visual details in his face. I zoomed in until his left eye filled most of my screen, enhanced the image as much as the video quality would allow, and felt my breath catch. There were lights reflected in Ethan's pupil, small, precise points of light arranged in a pattern, visible only because of the angle of the camera and the specific way the ambient light in Margaret's kitchen was hitting his face at that moment. The lights weren't coming from any source in the room. I'd set up the interview space myself, knew exactly where every lamp and window was positioned, and none of them could have created this kind of reflection. The pattern looked almost like stars, but too organized, too geometric, like the symbols Ethan had been drawing, but rendered in points of light instead of pencil marks. Sarah asked if I saw them, and I told her yes, asked her what she thought they meant. Her professional opinion, delivered in a voice that was trying very hard to remain clinical, was that either the video had been manipulated in some way I hadn't detected, or Ethan had been experiencing active visual phenomena during the interview itself. She told me to check other timestamps, walked me through 3 more moments in the footage where Ethan paused in his description or tilted his head slightly as if listening to something. In each case, when I zoomed in on Ethan's eyes, the same reflections were visible. Sometimes they appeared in both eyes, sometimes just one, but they were always there during moments when Ethan seemed to be accessing the memories he was describing. Sarah said that in her professional experience working with traumatized children, she'd never seen anything like this. Children who'd experienced genuine trauma typically showed specific physiological responses when recalling those experiences: elevated heart rate and pupil dilation, and micro-expressions indicating fear or distress. Ethan showed none of those markers. His heart rate remained steady throughout the interview, based on visible pulse points. His pupils didn't dilate abnormally. His facial expressions remained calm and focused. The only anomaly was the lights. I asked her what it meant, what possible explanation could account for lights appearing in a child's eyes during an interview about alien contact. Sarah was quiet for almost a minute, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost the clinical detachment and sounded genuinely shaken. She said that based on the evidence in the footage, Ethan hadn't been remembering an abduction that had happened 3 months ago. He'd been actively experiencing something during the interview itself, some kind of ongoing contact or communication that was occurring while I was filming him and asking my questions. The symbols he'd drawn weren't recovered memories or artistic interpretations of trauma. They were real-time transmissions, information being delivered through him while I was documenting it, thinking I was conducting an objective interview about past events. The implications of that assessment cascaded through my mind like dominoes falling. If Ethan had been in active contact during the interview, that meant the beings he described weren't simply taking children and returning them with memories. They were maintaining some kind of connection, some ongoing communication channel that could be activated remotely. It meant the gentle ones knew I was there, knew I was filming, had potentially orchestrated the entire interview as a way to communicate specific information to me through Ethan. The symbols hadn't been for Margaret or for Ethan's own processing of trauma. They'd been intended for my files, for my documentation project, for whatever purpose I'd been unknowingly serving for 11 years. I went back through other interviews in my archive with this new understanding, pulling footage from cases where children had produced drawings or described ongoing experiences. I found the same reflection pattern in the eyes of the Norwegian girl, Karina, visible in 3 separate moments during her interview. I found it in footage from Brazil, from Japan, from Iceland. Not in every case, but in the cases that involve those geometric symbols, the ones where children had drawn virtually identical patterns across years and continents. In each instance, the reflections appeared during moments when the child was describing what the beings had shown them or told them, suggesting that the communication wasn't a memory at all, but an active transmission happening while I was recording it. The revelation that destroyed me wasn't the confirmation that something genuinely unexplainable was happening to these children. It was the realization that I'd been part of it without knowing, that my careful documentation and clinical detachment had made me useful to whatever intelligence was orchestrating these events. I thought I was an observer, a neutral party creating an objective record, but I was actually a tool. Every interview I conducted, every symbol I cataloged, every case I added to my files was feeding information into a pattern I didn't understand, creating a map or a database or some kind of record that served purposes I couldn't begin to fathom. The children weren't victims in the traditional sense. They were messengers, and I was the delivery system. I plotted the symbols as coordinates, and they formed a pattern I recognized immediately. Each geometric design could be interpreted as a set of numbers if you understood them as spatial relationships rather than abstract art, angles and distances and points of intersection that translated into latitude and longitude when mapped onto Earth's surface. The process took me 2 full days of obsessive calculation, converting Ethan's drawings and the virtually identical patterns from other cases into numerical coordinates and marking each location on a digital map. The resulting pattern was unmistakable and horrifying. The coordinates pointed to specific locations where other contact events had been reported, not just cases I'd personally documented, but incidents from databases I'd accessed during my research, historical reports going back decades. Some of the coordinates matched sites I'd investigated. Others pointed to places I'd planned to visit, but hadn't yet, locations where I'd received initial contact from families asking for interviews that were currently pending in my schedule. 3 of the coordinates indicated sites where I'd been explicitly invited to conduct interviews in the coming months, including one in rural Canada, scheduled for 6 weeks from now, and another in northern Scotland that I'd tentatively agreed to visit in the fall. The pattern wasn't showing me where contact had occurred. It was showing me where contact would occur, or more accurately, where I would be documenting contact in the future. I wasn't a researcher following phenomena. I was a scout, mapping territory for something that was using my work to plan its next movements. The realization carried a particular kind of horror that went beyond simple fear, a vertigo that came from understanding that my entire professional identity had been constructed around serving a purpose I'd never consented to or understood. Every decision I'd made about which cases to pursue, which families to interview, which locations to travel to, I'd thought those were my choices based on my methodology and my professional judgment. But looking at the coordinates now, seeing how precisely they aligned with the pattern emerging from symbols drawn by children who shouldn't have had any knowledge of my work or my schedule, I understood that my choices had never been entirely my own. I'd been guided, subtly and patiently, towards specific cases that fit into a larger architecture I was only beginning to perceive. I checked my email and found a new message waiting, sent from an address that was just a string of numbers and letters with no identifiable sender name. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained only 3 lines. The first was a set of coordinates in the standard latitude-longitude format. The second was a date 3 weeks from the current day. The third was a single sentence that read, "Thank you for your service." I plugged the coordinates into a mapping program and watched the pin drop onto a location in northeast Portland, less than 2 miles from my apartment. The date was a Tuesday. I checked my calendar and found nothing scheduled for that day, just a blank square in the grid of my otherwise carefully planned life. The professional response would be to ignore it, to recognize this as either a hoax or a trap and refuse to engage. The rational response would be to contact authorities, though I had no idea what I would tell them or what evidence I could provide that would make any sense outside the context of my 11 years of research. The safe response would be to delete the email, pack up my files, and walk away from all of this before I became another data point in whatever pattern was unfolding. But I knew I wasn't going to do any of those things because the compulsion to understand had already consumed me in ways that made safety and rationality irrelevant. I'd spent more than a decade documenting cases while maintaining the distance that let me pretend I was separate from what I was studying. But that distance had been an illusion from the beginning. I thought about the children who'd disappeared, about Ethan tucking a note under his pillow before walking out into a field and vanishing without leaving footprints. I thought about Margaret finding his pajamas folded neatly, about her voice when she'd read me what he'd written. They came back for me like they promised. Don't be sad. The children who drew the symbols weren't being taken against their will. They were being collected, gathered, returned to whatever source had marked them as special and worth preserving. And the ones who disappeared weren't victims. They were graduates, moving on to whatever came next in a process I'd been documenting, without understanding that documentation was itself part of the process. The worst part, the detail that kept me awake during those last 3 weeks before the date in the email, was understanding what the gentle ones had meant when they told Ethan they were grateful for my work. I had been helpful. I'd created a comprehensive record of their activities, cataloged their patterns, identified their methods, all under the guise of objective research. I'd made myself useful by being thorough and systematic and emotionally detached, by treating each case as discrete data instead of recognizing the larger pattern until it was too late to do anything except see it clearly. I was a scout whether I'd intended to be or not, mapping territory and identifying subjects and creating infrastructure that something vast and patient and fundamentally incomprehensible could use for purposes that existed on timescales far longer than human lifetimes. I'm recording this because in 3 weeks I might not be able to. The date from the email is approaching and I've made my decision, though calling it a decision suggests I had real choice in the matter, and I'm not certain that's true anymore. I'm going to the coordinates. I have to know if the pattern leads to the children, if Ethan and Karina and Miguel and all the others are somewhere together, still existing in some form I can understand, or if the pattern leads to me becoming part of what took them, being absorbed into a process that I've been serving without knowing it since the moment I started this work 11 years ago. Either way, I've already crossed whatever threshold separated observation from participation, and there's no going back to the comfortable distance I used to maintain. I'm sharing this not because I expect vindication or believe anyone will take action based on what I'm describing. I'm sharing it because silence compounds, because carrying this alone while pretending to be a neutral observer was what made me useful to something that needed scouts, and didn't care whether those scouts understood what they were scouting for. The cases that broke me, that shattered the professional detachment I'd relied on to do this work, weren't the terrifying ones or the violent ones. They were the cases like Ethan's, where children described their abductors with affection and trust, where they used language like gentle and kind and patient, because I understand now that it's not force they're using to accomplish whatever they're accomplishing. It's something more insidious and more effective. They're making people want to go with them, want to serve them, want to be part of something larger, even when that something is incomprehensible and potentially terrifying. For 11 years, I told myself that professional detachment protected me, that observing without feeling made me safe and objective and valuable as a documentarian. I was wrong on every count. The detachment didn't protect me, it made me effective. It let me catalog patterns without recognizing what those patterns meant, without asking uncomfortable questions about why I was being drawn to specific cases, or why certain families contacted me at specific times. I thought I was choosing my research subjects based on methodology and geographic distribution and the quality of testimony. I never considered that I was being chosen, that my entire career had been gently guided toward creating exactly the kind of comprehensive database that something would need if it was conducting a long-term study of humanity and wanted detailed records of its interactions. If you're documenting something you don't fully understand, if you're observing what you think is random chaos and you start seeing patterns, stop and ask yourself who's really doing the documenting. Ask yourself if you're the researcher or the research, if your choices are genuinely your own, or if you're being moved through a landscape that was designed specifically to make you think you're in control. Because by the time you see the pattern clearly, you might already be part of it, and I don't know if there's a way back from that. Don't know if recognition changes anything or just makes you more consciously complicit in whatever role you've been assigned. The symbols are coordinates. The children are messengers. The gentle ones are patient because they're operating on timescales that make human urgency irrelevant. And I've been useful to them in ways I'm only beginning to understand, creating records and identifying patterns and mapping territories that serve purposes I'll probably never fully comprehend. In 3 weeks, I'm going to stand at a specific set of coordinates in Northeast Portland and wait to see what happens. And I honestly don't know if I'm doing it because I need answers or because I've been programmed to show up there the same way Ethan was programmed to walk out into that field in Australia. The line between curiosity and compulsion disappeared somewhere in the last 11 years, and I'm not sure it matters anymore which one is driving me. What I know is this: honesty has value, even when it doesn't change anything, even when it just confirms that you've been part of something terrible without realizing it. The children I've interviewed deserve to have their experiences documented, regardless of what those experiences were or what purpose that documentation served. And maybe someone reading this will recognize their own pattern before it's too late. Will see that the work they think they're doing independently is actually part of something larger and more coordinated than they realized. Or maybe not. Maybe this is just my way of leaving a record before I step into whatever comes next, making sure that someone knows I saw the pattern, even if seeing it didn't save me from it. My name is David Reese. I've interviewed 43 children who claimed they were taken by aliens, and I didn't believe them until I understood that belief was never the point. The point was documentation. The point was creating a comprehensive record that could be used by something that needed humans to map their own experiences because it couldn't or wouldn't do that work itself. I thought I was an investigator, but I was a tool. I thought I was maintaining objectivity, but I was being useful. And in 3 weeks, I'm going to find out what happens when a tool becomes conscious of its function, when a scout realizes they've been mapping territory for an operation that's already underway and has been longer than anyone alive can remember. I hope I'm wrong about all of this. I hope there's an explanation that doesn't require abandoning everything I thought I understood about autonomy and choice and the nature of research. But I've spent 11 years documenting impossible things, and I've learned that hope is just another form of distance, another way of avoiding seeing what actually is in front of you. And I'm done with distance. I'm done pretending I'm separate from what I study. In 3 weeks, I'll know exactly what that means.